Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be chair of our first panel. But first of all, thank you very much, Elisabeth, for your kind invitation for this great conference. And it feels like coming home. It is already my, I think, third or fourth time here in this beautiful city, in this building with great scholars. So thank you very much for this tradition. My name is Katarzyna Stoklosa. I'm associate professor from the University of Southern Denmark. It's my pleasure to lead our first panel on border enforcement, militarization, and walls. We will have three excellent presentations and four excellent scholars. First of all, I would like to introduce Lizzie Schick and David Donati for the presentation. Lizzie Schick from American Civil Liberties Union, and David Donati, the same, American Civil Liberties Union. Two great scholar specialists that have been working together on international dispute resolution. David, you said in July 24, I quote, "Texas is one of the most restrictive states in the country when it comes to abortion health care. But even in Texas, the laws are uniform and clear that pregnant women cannot be criminally liable for having an abortion." End of quote. I'm curious whether something has changed after January 25. But this is perhaps another topic. First, I would like to invite you to present your topic, keeping people in and keeping people out. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And we do have a slide presentation, if you could cue it up for us. I'll let Lizzie introduce herself in a moment. My name is David Donati, and I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Texas. You may be familiar with our work or not. I think after this presentation, you will learn a bit more about it. We're going to present on something a little bit specific, which is a report that our office has worked together on regarding Texas border militarization. So if you could go to the next slide, I will provide a little bit of context. The report, here's an agenda. We will introduce the issue area and the report. Lizzie will talk about our findings, and we will cover the recommendations that we made in that report. We made that report when the previous administration was in power, so a lot of the big issues were at this parallel separation of powers, where you had a federal government that viewed immigration in a particular way, and a state government that wanted to very much push against that. But absolutely, the recommendations that we made translate, and I think gain a little bit of force in a way that we will discuss here. And if you could go to the next one. I'm going to introduce Operation Lone Star, which is a bit of branding. But in 2021, President Joe Biden took office, and it was an election that was in many ways centered around immigration and the rights of immigrants. Joe Biden called it a battle for the soul of America. President Trump is one of the most restrictive anti-immigrant presidents in American history, to say nothing of his second term. So there was a fight, a discussion in American politics about immigration at a time when, number one, during the COVID pandemic, we saw a dramatic reduction in the number of people who were able to cross United States borders, and at a time when we've seen sort of unprecedented large-scale international migration. President Biden took office. The COVID pandemic was a little bit lighter in terms of its impact on migrants who sought to cross. And so for a number of reasons, we did have large-scale immigration into Texas. And I do want to emphasize that there is a structural reason for this in the United States, which is we have, just like every other country, our visa categories. These are the ways that you can come. And since the 1980s, American law has been clear that anybody who comes and petitions for asylum is eligible to apply for asylum. And our law is very clear that that stands whether or not you enter at a port of entry, which is a designated lawful area to enter, or between them. So American law is very clear on this point. The ACLU has litigated this issue several times, and there is no cap in American law to the number of people who can petition for asylum for good reason, because you have international crises, Holocaust, genocide, and we don't want to say, well, only 20,000 people can come in because we don't anticipate the scale of the problem. President Trump ignored that. President Biden subsequently ignored that. President Trump has continued to ignore that. But in 2021, we had growing pains. And Texas, particularly Texas Governor Greg Abbott, anticipated an opportunity to exploit immigration as a political tool and cudgel against the Biden administration. And so beginning in March of 2021, very early into the new administration, he announced Operation Lone Star. Operation Lone Star because Texas was, for a very brief period, its own country following secession from Mexico. So Governor Abbott announced Operation Lone Star, and Operation Lone Star relies on two geographic tricks. The first is the state of emergency. Texas, like the federal government, can declare states of disaster, which can open up new powers that aren't always there. But it had to do so in partnership with local counties. There are 254 counties in Texas. At first, not all of them wanted to play along with this game, but certainly some of them were very willing to do so. The second geographic trick is working with particular landowners. Texas borderlands are all privately owned, which makes us very different from Arizona, New Mexico, or California, other southern border states. So the state government negotiated with landowners and basically said, we are going to declare a state of disaster, which means that we open up new enhanced penalties under the law. So what was normally misdemeanor trespass, not punishable by incarceration, becomes an offense for which you can be jailed for up to a year. And then we're going to work with individual landowners who share our political philosophy to allow us, the state government, to enforce trespass laws on their property. That, plus a massive deployment of Texas National Guard, Department of Public Safety, meant that there were particular areas along the border where the state government could arrest individuals coming over to apply for asylum, which was their intention, and put them in state jails and prisons as a deterrent to further migration. The state would present this as a rousing success. It would say, we arrested X dozen people on this farm, they're criminal migrants, and it would toot its own horn, and it would be able to draw a lot of money from the state treasury as a result. We at the ACLU of Texas work on a lot of different border issues. This is one of them. We also work on the issue that Katarzyna was talking about, which is abortion access, and that is another sort of geographic migratory story in the sense that we have a state where abortion is completely banned, and the state has taken efforts to prevent people from traveling across state lines to access abortion. So we have international migration issues, we have domestic migration issues. For me as a civil rights lawyer, the issue is the freedom of movement, whether that is cross-national boundaries or internal to a country. So we do a lot of this work, and I promise not all of my slides will take that long to cover. But we saw this problem, and we had a series of hypotheses, but we have at the ACLU this excellent partnership. We actually are not the same organization. The ACLU is like a federal structure. So we have our national office, which works on particular issue areas or particular specializations, like Lizzie is a data specialist. And then we have our state affiliates. We have 53 of them. I'm at the ACLU of Texas, which means I focus on Texas issues, whatever they are. But we have close partnerships with our colleagues at ACLU National, and it becomes this big family of hundreds of attorneys and specialists who can work together on different issues. So we came to Lizzie and her colleagues, and we said, we have this program, Operation Lone Star, and we had a hypothesis. We didn't know how we could prove that hypothesis, but the hypothesis was, based on these two geographic tricks, would it be possible to map out what we suspected was happening, which is that the state was actually funneling people to cross on particular properties. So the idea being, they're presenting this problem, oh, we have X number of people on this farm that we apprehended. Our theory was that state officers were actually directing people to cross on that particular farm based on the agreements they were able to get at that time. That hypothesis was based on conversations with local public defenders, criminal defense attorneys, as well as my own personal experiences. I went down to the Texas borderlands and did a kayak trip on the Rio Grande, and I saw this with my own eyes of migrants would ask officers, they're not evading detection, they say, I want to present for asylum, where do I go? And the officers would say, go that way. And so the theory that we had, and the question that we had for our expert colleagues was, can we prove this? So that's how Lizzie got involved, and I'll let Lizzie take it from the data we requested and then the work that she did.
Great, thank you, David. So I'm Lizzie Schick. I'm a lead analyst on the technology team at ACLU National. And like David said, at National, what my team's mandate is to help affiliates do the kind of on-the-ground work that they know best, where they have the legal context, they have the understanding of the people, they have the knowledge of the history of their state. But at National, we have resources like data analytics capacity that we can bring to help them achieve their goals. So I'll say that we started with data that David and his colleagues had requested from the state of Texas. So this is publicly available data that you need to make a formal request for, but it's still public data. And we ended up with records of arrests made under Operation Lone Star, as well as records of court proceedings that pertain to Operation Lone Star. So the key findings for the report are pretty wide-ranging, despite us just having these two data sets. We found that Operation Lone Star demonstrated racial profiling and unconstitutional policing methods. We found that Operation Lone Star primarily arrested people accused of low-level offenses like trespassing, as David explained, rather than the drug-related offenses, human smuggling, or weapons charges that the state had purported to be focusing on. We found that Operation Lone Star overwhelmingly prosecuted U.S. citizens rather than migrants for the drug-related, human smuggling, and weapon charges. We found that Operation Lone Star expanded far beyond the border where it purported to focus. And we also found that Operation Lone Star data was inconsistent across state agencies. So I'm just going to share a few of our findings from the report because it's quite lengthy and we recommend you go read the whole thing. But this first plot shows the number of arrests by the charge type. So we classified charge types based on the text of the charge provided in the data from the state. And in this case, it's showing the proportion of arrests with that charge type that had that charge type alone and nothing accompanying it. And so this kind of demonstrates the point that trespassing charges were used to target people, even though this, like David said, was previously a misdemeanor under the sort of state of emergency that the governor of Texas had declared. This became grounds for an arrest alone. So you can see the vast majority of arrests with a trespass charge had no other accompanying charges that were purportedly the focus of Operation Lone Star.
And yeah, I think one thing to emphasize here is we're probably going to talk a lot about messaging and narrative at this conference. And so when you listen to state lawmakers talk about migration, they will always say we are interdicting criminal migrants. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime. That famous line from President Trump, and Greg Abbott is honestly worse. He will talk about sexual assault trophies hung on trees, just horrible language to paint this picture of we are being invaded. This is a literal quotation by what he calls military-age men who want to do us harm. And so one of the things we were able to use the data to show is, well, that's actually not who they're apprehending. Who they're apprehending for trespass are people whose exclusive crime is trespass.
Thank you, David. And then this plot shows another piece of what we found. This is showing that within those trespassing arrests, you can see from the start of those Operation Lone Star arrests, almost exclusively those arrests were of men. And up until September of 2022, when there was a successful case brought finding unconstitutional sex discrimination in the enforcement of Operation Lone Star, were those trespassing arrests then inclusive of non-male arrestee or people arrested as well. So this is just to show the sort of arbitrary and targeted nature of how these trespassing arrests were being weaponized. And then our final plot that we wanted to share here from the report is showing trespass arrest rates, and this is the arrest rate per 1,000 residents, broken down by the race of the person arrested, as well as whether the county where the arrest took place borders Mexico. And so this plot is showing how the arrests under Operation Lone Star purportedly were looking at border counties, purportedly, we're not engaging in unconstitutional discrimination, but you can see the arrest rates are significantly higher for Latine people, and that in border counties the disparity is significantly greater, as well as the arrest rates being higher for Latine people.
We made a series of recommendations based on this report, and they can feel in some ways, we had to discuss quite a lot, who is our audience for this particular report. And so a few of the things that were happening at this time, the state was commandeering local public lands. So very famously, they built a center of operations in a 47-acre park that belonged to a border community. They just plotted themselves down, they built fencing around it, and they said this is all now sort of the disaster command hub of the state of Texas, and then it would funnel immigrants over to that land and it would arrest them there, while at the same time substantially diminishing the community's access to their own park. So we recommended the return of those, and there's a lot of political salience to that recommendation. This is sort of a clarion call, but the United States has been in a state of emergency since the 1950s. Texas, you have to renew the disaster declaration every 30 days. Our governor has renewed the disaster declaration every 30 days. When President Trump came into office, day one, declaring a national emergency at the border, declaring an energy national emergency. So executive officers in the US have this remarkable capacity to declare states of exception and then leverage powers as a result of it. This is a huge problem for us because states of exception are the sort of venom to any system based on due process and individual liberty. We asked to repeal enhanced trespass penalties at that time to coordinate with the federal government. And I think very importantly to establish an independent monitor to oversee the Department of Public Safety, the Texas National Guard, and other Operation Lone Star actors. One of the things that we ran into is that the data that we were receiving is remarkable and also very inconsistent as between agencies. So this was a really striking early finding, which was you ask the Department of Public Safety, which is our state police force, how many Operation Lone Star arrests have you conducted? They say 45,000. And then you ask the Office of Court Administration, how many Operation Lone Star cases have you taken? They say 13,000. And so it's a question, well, how are you classifying these arrests? Who is deciding who goes into this system versus not? So there's no coherence or consistency as between it. We ultimately targeted this report towards lawmakers, particularly allies, but also people who are fiscally conservative, who can look at the billions and billions of dollars that the state is drawing upon for this program to say you can right-size it. Whether you believe that there's a problem here or not, at the end of the day, what we have is 13,000 individuals arrested for trespass who are now in county jails for up to a year or more at a time, costing the state millions and millions of dollars. We have 2 lawsuits against counties, including a class action for civil rights abuses within this process. So it's a potentially multi-million-dollar liability for the counties themselves on the backs of the state. And ultimately, this money can be so much better used. Looking forward, I very firmly believe that Texas Operation Lone Star has been a blueprint for the Trump administration's actions. We have seen the declaration that public lands in New Mexico and Texas are now military installations. They're outside. It's hard to imagine how they're military installations, but it's an emergency wave the magic wand trick of we can classify anything we want as a military zone, and therefore if a person is trespassing upon it or there without authorization, you can enhance the penalties. We've already begun to see these arrests and prosecutions in New Mexico, and we anticipate that it will be a trick that expands further outwards. As I said, public lands in Arizona, New Mexico, and California are often public. There's something called the Roosevelt easement, so it's very easy for the federal government to wave its wand and say, now if you do anything here, you're subject to more jail time than you would otherwise be eligible for. Something else that we've seen is the proposed allocation by the Trump administration of $45 billion to build border wall. That is a substantial increase over any amount of money ever dedicated towards border wall construction. And so one of the goals of using data in this way can be, can we treat this issue like we treat any other policy issue, whether we target it at political actors in the normal course of business or in the budgeting process, which is quite significant in the United States. If we make this about dollars and cents and you look at the sides of the ledger, are there people that you can win over? Because there are otherwise some people for whom this is a real political opportunity and there is no cost that is prohibitive in terms of the amount that they will spend on anti-immigration enforcement.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation with so much data and great recommendations. So let's hope that Trump administration will take something from you and will realize in its daily politics. Let's hope. Thank you very much. We come to this in our discussion. Now, please let me present our second or third speaker for the second presentation, Kenneth Madsen from the Ohio State University. Kenneth Madsen is a specialist on border barriers, the impact of border law enforcement activities on Arizona border communities. Kenneth, you have done a lot of research about legal mechanism behind border barrier construction and dynamics. Keeping people in, keeping people out. That's a new idea, that's a new conception, US mass incarceration and construction of border walls. Kenneth, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. My topic today is a more commentary on the personal journey of research and approaching a new angle for my work than a set of results or even an outline for a future project. But with that preface, I would like to ask you to do something that may be unusual or even uncomfortable for an academic gathering. So close your eyes, take a moment, if you will, to imagine the worst thing you have ever done. Don't worry, we're not going to have sharing time. This is just for you, so don't hold back. I'll give you just a few seconds here to reminisce. Now imagine that this worst thing you ever did determines who you are for the rest of your life. You can open your eyes now. When people think of you, that is all they think about. You are perpetually punished for it and can never move past it. When I was trained with the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program in 2021, we used this activity to think about how incarcerated individuals are often frozen in time and defined by a singular aspect of their lives. The goal of the activity is to try and move past the default that prisoners, unlike the rest of us, cannot improve or make changes to their lives, or for that matter, that there's simply a lot more to one's life in the first place than the singular offense that landed them in prison. As an academic, I try to keep my mind open to learning and new experiences, but as Thomas Kuhn's seminal 1962 work on scientific revolutions reminds us, we also have blinders on when it comes to our academic work. It's not that we actively believe or deny something, but rather we don't think of it as an option in the first place. Such it is that my time teaching a prison exchange class that involves both incarcerated and campus students over the past few years has given me some of the most intense personal and professional growth of my career, and I see it in my students as well. It is the local equivalent to study abroad. So it was this past year that I began working on a chapter on healing and justice beyond walls. My task was to find connections between prison walls, as seen here on the left, and the type of walls I more typically study, outdoor border barriers or walls between countries, on the right. But it made me think about how many in the US also defined migrants in flat, static ways that do not account for the diverse aspects of their lives. Instead, like prisoners, they are a demonized other, culturally and often racially different and not worthy of what we expect for ourselves. This is perhaps surely not a surprise to many of us here today, but brings to the forefront ways in which my research on border walls intersects with my teaching in prison exchange programs. This project is an outgrowth of a collaborative project between myself and an incarcerated member of a think tank I am involved in. It is exactly the type of thing I love to do, bringing academics and non-academics together, but is also fitting on both fronts. I am trying to transcend the very barriers we are talking about. This particular chapter is a co-authored publication, as I said, but it's with someone I've never met, who is currently serving time in an Ohio penitentiary. He is a member of TPOC, the Pantheon of Critical Criminologists, a street participatory action research team formed at a men's prison in January 2018. Members have spent 5 years focusing on group projects related to prison and post-prison life, and through this project, incarcerated and formerly incarcerated members are partnered with academics to write chapters for the book. As you might imagine, there are lots of physical and non-physical barriers to our work, such as limits on correspondence. In many ways, we're living what we are writing about. Most recently, in an effort to limit the smuggling of drugs in Ohio prisons, they have gone paperless with strict limits on sending paper back and forth. A few people brought in drugs that way, and now no one can bring in papers. One person makes a bomb out of a shoe, and we all take our shoes off when boarding an airplane. Sound familiar? All mail in and out is screened by a third-party facility, leading to extensive delays and sometimes the loss of material. Digital alternatives are also highly restricted. At the same time, I've been trying to work out a co-authored publication with a colleague in Iran, but have been stymied by US sanctions limiting the extent to which I might freely write with a fellow academic living in that country. The point of the project is to increase dialogue between the global north and south, that we've talked about already this morning, and academics in various countries. As with the prison collaboration situation, it was a much bigger task than I had bargained for. This comes at a dark time in terms of fighting for such collaboration. Not all interaction is prohibited, but getting a clear answer from my own institution, risk-averse in the United States, even before the November elections, was formidable. The process is arduous with no end in sight, but it reminds me that as an academic, that the political environment I am facing is not something new. Others have faced it for a long time. I am just a relative newcomer to the game. With the prison project, I'm interested in the many ways that prisons and border walls act in similar ways. In 2012, geographers Jenna Lloyd, Matthew Mitchelson, and Andrew Burridge wrote that walls and cages are fundamental to managing the wealth, social inequalities, and opposition to the harms created by capitalism in the present round of neo-colonial dispossession. In this sense, prison walls and border walls are flip sides of the same coin, operating in different locations and at different scales, but in conjunction with each other to manage the neoliberal project that is contemporary life. This is recognized by my TPOC co-author, who corresponded that in his experience, border walls and prison fences are nothing more than an indirect message to those behind them that those who built them do not wish to divide the spoils anymore. There's a parallel rise between border enforcement and incarceration, and not just because they feed into each other. Attempting migrants are incarcerated, and the huge dragnet that is the prison system in the US often picks up and deports undocumented individuals as well. In the bigger picture, however, one of the most dramatic similarities between border and prison walls is who benefits compared to who pays a price for those restrictions on movement. Both sets of restructures tend to restrict movement by those already marginalized and disempowered, while those of greater economic means are typically not caught up in either justice system. They have more resources at their disposal to fight such a possibility, and they more easily traverse international boundaries. As Alexander has written in her 2010 book, The New Jim Crow, US prisons are sold as race neutral, but clearly they have a disproportionate impact on disciplining the African American population in the country. Contemporary prisons grew out of the elimination of a more egregious and easily recognizable racist system of social control that carried the original name of Jim Crow. One of those elements is the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which some of you may recognize as the amendment that outlawed slavery. Under Jim Crow, substantial amounts of plantation labor in the US was replaced by prison labor because there was a loophole in that amendment that allows slavery to exist up to and including the present day if one is convicted of a crime. On the migration side of this, we see the equivalent whereby migration may be let in, restricted, tolerated, or alternatively cracked down on domestically, depending upon US labor needs. At a fundamental level then, prison and border walls are both about who belongs and who does not, whose lives are valued and whose are dismissed. Both also support the neoliberal economy by reducing social and economic mobility and thereby disciplining labor. While both types of structures promise greater security, they usually fail to deliver in practice. Walls do not establish security, but rather the illusion of security. Walls are high-profile performative acts. Migrants are diverted, not stopped. Similarly, prison walls reflect the tough-on-crime credentials of politicians rather than a serious attempt at rehabilitation and reintegration, or even just a fair punishment that one then can move past. Fear, blame, and scapegoating are common approaches to public discourse surrounding border walls and prisons. We may recognize these as the targets of populist ire, but the dynamic existed long before the political environment of the 21st century. People are placed behind bars, whether kept out of a country or within a prison, to make an example out of them and deter others. But the structural challenges of low income, drug abuse, and other social ills are never fully addressed. Complex issues do not break through to the level of policy implementation. Again, I've referenced my TPOC co-author on these issues. Administrators and politicians who are holding the keys that can unlock the old mindset which continue to cultivate false narratives about immigrants who are simply seeking a better life and incarcerated adults who seek a second chance. We as a nation need to revisit the rules or laws that were put in place. We must stop looking at these issues as unchangeable. We will remain a nation embracing exclusion unless we are willing to address the root cause of the ignorance that propels the minds of those who have the power to actually facilitate and make changes to a system that isn't working. Incarcerated individuals are largely punished and forgotten, not rehabilitated. In rare cases are such individuals prepared for successful re-entry other than supervision through parole, which then puts them back behind bars should they miss a step. A few months ago, members of my think tank expressed concern over just such a case where someone who failed to be picked up by a family member upon release was simply given $100 and dropped off at a bus stop to make his way to Cleveland on his own. Think of how much the world may have changed in that person's 20 years behind bars and how the cards were stacked against them. In terms of both borders and border walls as well as prisons, abolitionists have pushed back against this new normal to urge society to consider alternatives to these structures. But the current political environment is clearly stacked against these movements. Beyond consideration of the physical landscapes, both prisons and border barriers are backed up with what Lloyd et al. Call paper walls, or laws and regulations restricting migration and criminalizing various activities. These paper regimes back up the physical structures and can brand a person as someone who has attempted to enter illegally, barring them from re-entry even with the proper documents. Similarly, being branded domestically as a felon comes with challenges finding a job or even a place to live. There are a lot of protected cases against which discrimination is protected, or at least there used to be in the US. But in the new Jim Crow era, being an ex-felon is not one of them, and employers and landlords are legally protected from accusations of discrimination in such cases. Paying one time is not sufficient. In both cases, walls are merely the most public-facing symbol demonstrating elected officials' hardline credentials to the voting public, while the root challenges of social ills continue beyond the headlines.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, for your excellent presentation with these heavy pictures, scoring pictures, and I think for the moment there's a silence in the room. So, really great. Thank you. Our fourth presenter, it's my pleasure to introduce you Damien Simonneau, Associate Professor and Research Fellow at the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilization in Paris, and Research Fellow at the French Collaborative Institute of Migration. Damien's research focuses on contemporary border security, and you will present us today empirical and conceptual elements on the basis of your archive research and observation. I would like to underline that Damien's research is comparative research as well. You have done your own research in the Palestine, Israel, and US-Mexico border, so you have a broad perspective in your analysis. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. So I would not present a completely structured research. I would rather build on what we said last year in Fez to try to raise outlines basically of a research agenda on how to improve our knowledge on border militarization by maybe crossing literature and try to implement that. And I would also, of course, talk about my current research on how do I deal with border militarization right now, or where I want to move, actually. So this presentation is really more open for discussion than definite result as it has been presented, especially before. But before going to that, before going into this research agenda on border militarization, I just want to be first grateful to many people in this room, because basically last September in France at Edition Stock, I published an essay for a greater audience. So it's not an academic book proper, which is called Why Welling Yourself In, and which is basically trying to summarize how do we study border militarization from the field of border studies, migration studies. So many of your works are actually quoted in this book. There is also a list of different elements at the end, and that has been actually a very important journey for me since last September to meet different type of audience and talk about the different way we study border militarization. So I'm grateful to the different conferences here in Montreal and in Fez for actually helping me providing this kind of summary. But moving to the topic of where do we move now in border militarization studies, in one of the chapters, of course, I'm dedicating elements about how do we study wars as defensive tools. I recall, of course, that there have been work by historians that look at former fortification process in history. There are also works of genealogy of tactics, know-how on obstacles. I'm thinking especially about Olivier Razak's history of barbed wire, for instance, that are looking at the materiality of things and how it has been moving in history. I'm thinking also about David Wine's work on the US bases, for example, in the Midwest towards something more global. I'm also looking at the so-called debate about efficiency, and of course how borderlands have been transformed into space of death, as some anthropologists, colleagues of mine, Kobylinski and Fourie, are quoted it. Basically, those dimensions, those defensive dimensions, are of course raising many questions, and especially the very important question right now of circulation. How those know-how, technologies, obstacles, tactics are circulating from one borderlands to another, and how it is confusing more and more border policing and border militarization, the police and the military. And this is the puzzle that, of course, I would try to develop. And here, for instance, I just gave you an example of something that was published in 2025, British engineers to support the Polish border fortification, for instance, with Belarus right now. Or I'm also mentioning about this map on the right, which is about the border walls that actually France erected during the Algerian independence war in the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, which is in its shaping very similar, for instance, to what Israel has been constructing in the West Bank. And this is something that struck me when I was having some interviews with some military engineers, especially in Israel. So the research agenda that we try to move on is to, of course, not only study the materiality of border walls, which has been, of course, detailed in many different research work, not only the politicization and the securitization of it, but basically look at how militarism and basically border militarization engineering is also a way to normalize and banalize the construction of border walls. So I argue that, of course, architecture and materiality needs to be inserted into their socio-political and economic condition of creation, systematization, and international diffusion, which is a great driver of border security and border walls nowadays. The questions I want to raise are the following. What is actually a template? What is considered to be a template in border militarization? What is considered to be a lab? Is there such a thing as a lab? What is actually circulating or not? How is it copied? What is considered as a solution to border militarization especially for experts? And I try to look at that, of course, and I will begin with that by looking at the condition of production of a know-how of military engineering, of border presence and border control and territorial presence by trying to specify the Israeli engineering on border security. And I will detail this ongoing research. I'm not going to present everything, of course, and after I will draw towards new outline, towards where we should move on, I think, in this field. So I've been looking over the last 2 years towards the wall and tower template in Israel, which is one architectural element of territorial presence and construction of many different kibbutzim, moshavim in Israel, for instance, in the 1930s, in the previous, in the Yishuv before the creation of the State of Israel in British Mandate Palestine. So I've been looking, of course, at different types of archives, and there are actually numerous of them, and they are mostly online, and in 4 specific museums in Israel that are in charge of showing this kind of history towards different kind of participants. The photo that you see in the middle is the photo of one of these museums in Negba, which is in southern Israel, in the north of Sderot, for instance. And when you look, of course, at all those different elements, you have different testimonies, narratives, videos, even in English, that are trying to portray the construction of such wall and tower elements back in the 1940s in English for an audience in the UK and in the US particularly. And you have, of course, testimony of the Bedouins that are living around, upon which lands was actually acquired by Israeli settlers. So if I try to specify that, of course, I'm not looking only at the architectural aspect of it, but I'm also looking, for instance, at how this model has been considered as something that could be copied and generalized in the building up of the warfare military engineering inside the Israeli army back in the 1948, 1949. So I look, for instance, at the characteristic in terms of defense and surveillance, the role of the tower, for instance, the presence in what was considered to be a dangerous area with the fear of infiltration of enemy, which is, of course, a classical representation of enmity in Israeli military culture. I look, of course, at land appropriation, building of lands, for instance, by especially working with some NGO that are also trying to document this part of history, of course. I look at agriculture and basically how these kind of settlements have been turned profitable. I look at the technicity and also the engineering as a dynamic and the build-up of it and the planning, the blurring between civilian appearance and military appearance at that time, and also the communication campaign that have been created upon that. I also look at the colonial interaction, because if you see in some of the photo over here, many of the photos are actually documenting encounters between the Dutch Jewish settlers and the Bedouins nearby about how they interacted, what was the role in terms of buying land, for instance, and forbidding the access to agriculture now. And there are, of course, NGOs that are documenting the situation of Bedouins in the Negev that needs also to be contacted and work with to better specify this history. So I look also at colonial interaction. By basically doing that, I try also to make link with other types of settlements and territorial presence in the border areas of Israel across time. The Nahalim movement in the 1950s, the settlements and today outposts that are also reproducing those kind of tactics and developing them. We can also look at other elements of exportation of such military engineering in other areas, for instance, that has been documented by the NGO Grain in Angola, in Kashmir, and also in the military engineering in reinforcing the border wall in Western Sahara also. So there are also a bunch of literature to look at it. By doing that, basically, I want to specify border militarization as a template according to those different lines. I think that indeed we need to look at the technical dimension, the military logistic, and the building of infrastructure, and there are research work doing that, of course. We need to look at the colonial dimension, especially the control of population and how it is situated in a frame of land conquest and control of a settler population, of an indigenous population that could be replicable in many border areas. We look at the security definition, the political economy dimension. How is it made profitable, especially nowadays when we have more public-private relation and when the profitability is less clear, let's say, and look at the communication, the moral justification, and the narratives that are, of course, created to justify that. So, to conclude, I would say basically that I think that if we want to tackle those different dimensions and look at the homogenization of border militarization along this line, I think that there are a certain number of literature that needs to be crisscrossed. First of all is to look at strategic studies from a critical gaze, of course, by looking at how those different strategies are situated in land warfare perimeter control and constitution of sanctuary, profondeur stratégique, as we would say also in French, all the tactical debates on maneuver, fortification, and surveillance that have been, for instance, studying when we look at the border walls that Israel built along Gaza and also in the West Bank, at what is considered to be a military innovation. How do we tackle military innovation, and especially how do we classify military innovation in colonial and post-colonial situation? And then, of course, we can get inspired of many different research work that have been looking at counterinsurgency measures, for instance, counterinsurgency procedure that have already done this kind of reflection about circulation of military tactics from one context to another. The second bunch of literature, which is more familiar to many border scholars here, I'm sure, is border security as military and police practices, how the notion of solution is being created through technology, through the materiality, but also the engineering, the knowledge that is produced out of it. But also, I think that we need to complement this literature with the notion of militarism. Basically, how all those different tactics that are not only situated in situation of war, official situation of warfare, is blurred, is mixed towards preparation of a society for war. This is, for instance, becoming more and more clear when you look at Eastern European borders nowadays. I was mentioning Poland and Belarus, the Baltic countries, and Russia, and Finland and Russia. But basically, this confusion, of course, needs to be better addressed. And then, of course, the other bunch of literature is the circulation of practices and knowledge on border security. How do we classify it? Of course, what is the role of security experts, discourse, techniques, military cooperation, and finally, political economy. So these are just basic outlines about how I think the field should be moving to better address actually this homogenization of border militarization, and I would be actually very happy to discuss it here or after around the coffee about this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Damien, for your great, excellent ideas, and so broad, and I'm sure you will take many of them and include, enrich our research on borders and wars.
Merci.
Thank you very much for the three presentations. It has been excellent mixture combination of knowledge, ideas, possible research in the future, and implementation. That's so important. Let me join with the applause for our speakers to say thank you very much.